Grand, that's us, and let's get started on Chapter 1. Of the first few hauntings I investigated with Lockwood and Co., I intended to say little, in part to protect the identity of the victims, and in part because the gruesome nature of the incidents, but mainly because, in a variety of ingenious ways, we succeeded in messing them all up. There, I've admitted it. Not a single one of those early cases ended as neatly as we would have wished. Yes, the Mort Lake horror was driven out, but only as far as Richmond Park, where even now it stalks by night amongst the silent trees. Yes, both the grey spectre of Adelgate and the entity known as the Clattering Bones were destroyed, but not before several further, and now I think unnecessary, deaths. And as far as the creeping shadow that haunted young Mrs. Andrews, to the imperilment of her sanity and her hemline, wherever she may continue to wander in the world, poor thing, there it follows too. So it was not exactly an unblemished record we took with us, Lockwood and I, when we walked up the path to 62 Sheen Road on that misty autumn afternoon and briskly rang the bell. We stood on the doorstep with our backs to the muffled traffic and Lockwood's gloved right hand clasping upon the bell pull. Deep in the house, the echoes faded. I gazed at the door, at the small sun blisters in the varnish and the scuffs on the letterbox, at the 4 diamond panes of frosted glass that showed nothing beyond except darkness. The porch had a forlorn and unused air, its corners choked with the same sodden beech leaves that littered the path and lawn. Okay, I said, remember our new rules. Just don't blab about anything you see. Don't speculate openly about who killed who, or how, or when. And above all, don't impersonate the client. Please, it never goes down well. That's an awful lot of don'ts, Lucy, Lockwood said. Too right it is. You know, I've got an excellent ear for accents. I copy people without thinking. Fine, copy them after the event, not loudly, not in front of them, and particularly not when they're a 6'6" Irish dock worker with a speech impediment, and we're a good half-mile from the public road. Yes, he was quite nimble for his size, Lockwood said. Still, the chase will have kept us fit. Sense anything? Not yet, but I'm hardly likely to out here. You? He let go of the bell pull and made some minor adjustment to the collar of his coat. Oddly enough, I have. There was a death in the garden sometime in the last few hours, under that laurel halfway up the path. I assume you're going to tell me it's only a smallish glow. My head was tilted to one side, my eyes half closed. I was listening to the silence of the house. Yes, about mouse-sized, Lockwood admitted. Suppose it might have been a vole. I expect a cat got it or something. So, possibly not part of our case, if it was a mouse? Probably not. Beyond the frosted panes, the interior of the house, I spied a movement, something shifting in the hall's black depths. Okay, here we go, I said. She's coming. Remember what I said. Lockwood bent his knees and picked up the duffel bag beside his feet. We both moved back a little, preparing pleasant, respectful smiles. We waited. Nothing happened. The door stayed shut. There was no one there. As Lockwood opened his mouth to speak, we heard footsteps behind us on the path. I'm so sorry, the woman emerging from the mist had been walking slowly, but as we turned, she accelerated into a token little trot. So sorry, she repeated. I was delayed. I didn't think you'd be so prompt. She climbed the steps, a short, well-padded individual with a round face expanding to middle age. Her straight, ash-blonde hair was fixed in a no-nonsense manner by a clip above her ears. She wore a long black skirt, a crisp white shirt, and an enormous woolen cardigan with sagging pockets at the side. She carried a thin folder in one hand. Mrs. Hope, I said. Good evening, madam. My name is Lucy Carlyle, and this is Anthony Lockwood of Lockwood and Co. We've come about your call. The woman halted on the topmost step, but one. The woman halted on the topmost step, but one, and regarded us with wide eyes, in which the unusual emotions featured. The usual emotions featured. Distrust, resentment, uncertainty, and dread. They were all there. become a standard in our profession, so we didn't take it personally. Her gaze darted back and forth between us, taking in our neat clothes and carefully brushed hair, the polished rapiers glittering at our belts, the heavy bags we carried. It lingered long on our faces. She made no move to go past us to the door of the house. Her free hand was thrust deep into her pocket of the cardigan, forcing the fabric down. Just the two of you? She said at last. Just us, I said. You're very young. Lockwood ignited his smile. Its warmth lit up the evening. That's the idea, Mrs. Hope. You know the way it has to be. Actually, I'm not Mrs. Hope. Her own wan smile summoned an involuntary response to Lockwood's, flicking across her face and vanished, leaving anxiety behind. I'm her daughter, Susie Martin. I'm afraid Mother isn't coming. But we arranged to meet her, I said. She was going to show us around the house. I know, the woman looked down at her smart black shoes. I'm afraid she's no longer willing to set foot in here. The circumstances of Father's death were horrible enough, um, but recently the nightly disturbances have been too persistent. Last night it was very bad, and Mother decided she'd had enough. She's staying with me now. We'll have to we'll have to sell up. But obviously we can't do it until the house has been made safe. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Which is why you're here. Excuse me, but shouldn't you have a superior? I thought an adult had to be present during an investigation. Exactly how old are you? Old enough and young enough, Lockwood said, smiling. The perfect age. Strictly speaking, madam, I said, the law states that an adult is only required if the operatives are undergoing training. It's true that some of the bigger agencies always use supervisors, but that's their private policy. We're fully qualified and independent. We don't find it necessary. In your experience, Lockwood said sweetly, or in our experience, adults just get in the way. But of course, we do have our licenses here if you want to see them. The woman ran a hand across the smooth surface of her neat blonde hair. No, no, that won't be necessary. Since Mother clearly wanted you, I'm sure it'll be fine. Her voice was neutral and uncertain. There was a brief silence. Thank you, madame. I glanced back towards the quiet waiting door. There's just one other thing. Was someone else home? Whenever we rang the bell, I thought... Her eyes rose rapidly and met mine. No, that's quite impossible. I have the only key. I see. I must have been mistaken. Well, I won't delay you, Mrs. Martin said. Mother's completed the form you sent her. She sent out the buff folder. I hope that will be useful. I'm sure it will. Lockwood tucked it somewhere inside his coat. Thank you very much. Well, we'd better get started. Tell your mother we'll be in touch in the morning. The woman handed him a ring of keys. Somewhere along the road, a car horn blared, to be answered by another. There was plenty of time till curfew, but night was falling and people were growing antsy. They wanted to get home. Soon there'd be nothing moving in London streets but trails of mist and twisting moonbeams. Nothing, at least, any adult could see. Susie Martin was conscious of this too. She raised her shoulders, pulled her cardigan tight. Well, I'd better be going. I suppose I should wish you luck. She looked away. So very young. How terrible that the world should have to come to this. Good night, Mrs. Martin, Lockwood said. Without reply, she pattered down the steps. In a few seconds she had vanished among the mists and laurels in the direction of the road. She's not happy, I said. I think we'd be better off this case tomorrow morning. Better get it solved tonight then, Lockwood said. Ready? I patted the hilt of my rapier. Ready. He grinned at me, stepped up to the door and, with a magician's flourish, turned the key in the lock. When entering the house occupied by a visitor, it's always best to get in quick. That's one of the first rules you learn. Never hesitate, never linger on the threshold. Why? Because for those few seconds, it's not too late. You stand there in the doorway, with the fresh air on your back and the darkness up ahead, and you'd be an idiot if you didn't want to turn and run. But as soon as you acknowledge that, your willpower starts to drain away through your boots, and the terror starts building in your chest, and bang, that's it. You're compromised before you begin. Lockwood and I both knew this, so we didn't hang around. We slipped straight through, put our bags down, and shut the door softly behind us. We stood still with our backs against it, watching and listening, side by side. The hall of the house, lately occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Hope, was long and relatively narrow, though the high ceilings seemed to make it quite large. It was floored with black and white marble tiles, set diagonally and flanked by palely papered walls. Halfway along, a steep staircase rose into shadows. The hall kinked around to the left and continued into a void of black. Doorways opened on either side, gaping, choked in darkness, all of which could have been nicely illuminated if we'd put on the lights, of course, and there was the switch on the wall right there, but we didn't attempt to use it. You see, a second rule that you learn is this: electricity interferes. It dulls the senses and makes you weak and stupid. It's much better to watch and listen in the dark. It's good to have that fear. We stood in silence, doing what we do. I listened. Lockwood watched. In the cold of the house, the air had that slightly musty, sour smell that you get in every unloved place. I leaned in towards Lockwood. No heating, I whispered. Mm-hmm. Something else too, you think? Mm-hmm. As my eyes grew used to the dark, I saw more details. Beneath the curl of the banister was a polished little table on which sat a china bowl of potpourri. There were pictures on the wall, mostly faded posters of time-old musicals and photographs of rolling hills and gentle waves, all pretty innocuous. In fact, it wasn't all an ugly hallway. In bright sunlight, it might have looked quite pleasant, but not so much now, with the last light of the door panes stretching out like skewered coffins on the floor in front of us, with our shadows neatly framed inside them, and with that manner of old Mr. Hope's death in the very place, hanging heavy in our minds. I breathed hard to calm myself and shut out morbid thoughts. Then I closed my eyes against the taunting darkness and listened. Listened. Hall landings and stairways are the arteries and airways of any building. It's here that channeling is channeled, or everything is channeled. You get echoes of everything currently going on in the connecting rooms. Sometimes you also get other noises that, strictly speaking, ought not to be there at all. Echoes of the past, echoes of hidden things. This was one such time. I opened my eyes, picked up my bags, and walked slowly down the hall towards the stairs. Lockwood was already standing by the little polished table under the banister. His face shone dimly in the light from the door. "Heard something?" he said. "Yep." "What?" "A little knocking sound. Comes and goes. It's very faint. I can't tell where it's coming from, but it'll get stronger. It's scarcely dark yet. What about you?" He pointed at the bottom of the steps. "You remember what happened to Mr. Hope, of course. Fell down the stairs and broke his neck." "Exactly. Well, there's a tremendous residual death glow right there, still lingering 3 months after he died. I should have brought my sunglasses, it's so bright." So what Mrs. Hope told George on the phone stacks up. Her husband tripped and tumbled. He tumbled down and hit the ground hard. He glanced up at the shadowy stairwell. Long, steep flight. Nasty way to go. I bent low, squinting at the floor in the half-dark. "Yeah, look at how the tiles have cracked. He must have fallen with tremendous Two sharp cracks sounded on the stairs. Air moved violently against my face. Before I could react, something large and soft, horribly heavy, landed precisely where I'd stood. The impact of it jarred my teeth. I jumped back, ripping my rapier from my belt. I stood against the wall, weapon raised and shaking, heart clawing at my chest, my eyes staring wildly side to side. Nothing. The stairs were empty. No broken body sprawled lifeless on the floor. Lockwood leaned casually against the banister. It was too dark to be certain, but I swear he raised an eyebrow. He hadn't heard a thing. "You all right, Lucy?" I breathed hard. No, I just got an echo of Mr. Hope's last fall. It was very loud and very real. It was like he'd landed right on top of me. Don't laugh, it's not funny. Sorry, well, something's stirring early tonight. It's going to be interesting later. What time do you make it? Having a watch with a luminous dial is my third recommended rule. It's best if it can also withstand sudden drops in temperature and strong ectoplasmic shock. Not yet 5, I said. Fine. Lockwood's teeth weren't quite as luminous as my watch, but when he grins it's a close run thing. Plenty of time for a cup of tea. Then we'll find ourselves a ghost. I just go straight into chapter 2. These chapters are shorter than Harry Potter. Not just as tiring. Right. When you go out hunting wicked spirits, it's simple things that matter most. The silvered point of your rapier flashing in the dark, the iron filings scattered on the floor, the sealed canisters of best Greek fire, ready as a last resort. But tea bags, brown and fresh and plenty of them, and made, for preference, by Pitkin Brothers of Bond Street, are perhaps the simplest and best of all. Okay, it may not save your life like a sword tip or an iron circle can, but they haven't the protective power of a sudden wall of fire. But they do provide something just as vital. They help keep you sane. It's never pleasant sitting in a haunted house, waiting for the dark. Night presses in around you, and the silence beats against your ears. And soon, if you're not careful, you start to see or hear things that are the products of your mind. In short, you need distractions. Each of us at Lockwood's has our preference. I do a bit of drawing. George has his comics. Lockwood reads himself the gossip magazines. But all of us like our tea and biscuits, and that night in the Hope's house was no exception. We found the kitchen table at the far end of the hall, just beyond the stairway. It was a nice enough room, neat and white and modern, and noticeably warmer than the hall. It had no supernatural traces of any kind. All was quiet. The knocking sound I'd heard was inaudible here, and there was no repetition of the nasty bumps on the stairs. I've got a kettle going, while Lockwood lit an oil lamp and set the table. By its light, we took off our rapiers and work belts and laid them out before us. Our belts have 7 separate clips and pouches. We went through these in silence, systematically checking the contents while the kettle wheezed and huffed away. We'd already checked everything back in the office, but we have more than happy to do it again. A girl at Rotwell's had died the previous week after forgetting to restock her magnesium flares. Outside the window, the sun was gone. Faint clouds choked the blue-black sky. The mist had risen to engulf the garden. Beyond the black hedges, light shone in the other houses. They were near, but also distant, cut off from us like ships passing across deep water. We put our belts on. We checked the Velcro strapped around our rapiers. I fixed the teas and brought them to the table. Lockwood found the biscuits. We sat together in the oil light, flickering, and the shadows danced in the corners of the room. At last, Lockwood pulled out the collar of his greatcoat high above his neck. "Let's see what Mr. Hope has to say for himself," he said, stretching out a long, thin hand for the folder lying on the table. Lamplight glimmered darkly in his flop of hair. As he read, I checked the thermometer clipped to my belt. 15 degrees. Not warm. Roughly what you'd expect from an unheated house this time of year. I took my notebook from its pouch and jotted down the room and the figure. I also recorded the details of the oral phenomena I'd experienced in the hall. Lockwood tossed the folder aside. "Well, that was useful." "Really?" "No, I'm being ironic. Or is it sarcastic? I can never remember." "Irony's cleverer, so you're probably being sarcastic." "What'd she say?" Absolutely nothing of any use. She might as well have written it all in Latin for all the good it does us. Here's a summary. The Hopes lived here for 2 years. Before that, they were down in Kent somewhere. She gives a lot of irrelevant detail about how happy they were. Hardly any curfews, ghost lamps, never on. How you could go for a late night walk in the evening and only meet your living neighbours. That sort of thing. Don't believe a word of it myself. Kent's had one of the biggest outbreaks of anywhere else in London, or outside London, according to George. I sipped my tea. That's where the problem began, I thought. So they say. Anyhow, then they moved up here. All fine, no trouble in the house, no manifestations of any kind. Husband changed his job, started working from home. That's 6 months ago. Still nothing funny going on. Then he fell down the stairs and died. Hold it, I said. How did he fall? Tripped, apparently. What I mean is, was he alone? According to Miss Hope, he was. She was in bed. Happened during the night. She says her husband was a bit distracted in the weeks before he died. Hadn't been sleeping well. She says he got up to get a drink of water. I grunted non-committally. Right. Lockwood flashed me a glance. You think she pushed him? Not necessarily, but it would provide a motive for the haunting, wouldn't it? Husbands don't normally haunt wives, except when there's a reason. Pity she didn't want to talk to us. I'd have liked to have sussed her out. Well, you can't always tell by looking, Lockwood said. He shrugged his narrow shoulders. Did I ever tell you about the time I met the notorious Harry Crisp? Sweet-faced man, he was, soft-voiced and twinkly-eyed. Good company and very plausible. He'd actually got me to lend him a tenner. Yet it turned out in the end he was the most appalling murderer who liked nothing better than to. I held up my hand. You did tell me that about 1,000,000 times. Oh, well, point is, Mr. Hope could be coming back for a host of other reasons, have nothing to do with vengeance. Something left undone, for instance. A will he hasn't told his wife about. Some stash of money hidden under the bed. Yeah, maybe. So the disturbances began soon after his death. A week or two later. She was mostly away from the house up until then. Once she moved back, she began to be aware of an unwelcome presence. Lockwood tapped the folder. Anyway, she doesn't describe it here. She says she gave a full account to our receptionist over the phone. I grinned. Receptionist? George won't like that. Well, I've got his notes with me, if you want to hear them. Go on then. Lockwood sat back expectantly. What's she been saying? George's notes were in an inside pocket of my jacket. I took them out and unfolded them, smoothing the papers on my knee, and scanned them briefly, and cleared my throat. Are you ready? Yes. A moving shape, I said with great ceremony, as I refolded the papers and put them away. Lockwood blinked with outrage. A moving shape? That's it? No further details? Come on. Was it big, small, dark, bright, what? It was, and I quote, a moving shape that appeared in the back bedroom and followed me out across the landing. Word for word, that's what she told George. Lockwood dunked a forlorn biscuit in his tea. Hardly the finest description of all time. I mean, you wouldn't want to try to sketch it, would you? No, but she's an adult. What do you expect? It's never going to be any good. The sensations she's had are more revealing. She said it felt like someone was looking for her, that it knew she was there, but it couldn't find her. And she thought it finding her would, and she thought of it right. And the thought of it finding her was more than she could bear. Well, Lockwood said, that's a little better. She sensed a purpose, which suggests a type too. But whether the late Mrs. Hope's up to, or whatever the late Mr. Hope is up to, he's not the only one at work in this house tonight. There's us as well. So, what do you say? Shall we take a look around? I drained my cup of tea and set it carefully on the table. I think that's a very good idea. For almost an hour, we made a tour downstairs, briefly flashing our torches to check the contents of each room, but otherwise moving in near darkness. The oil lantern we left burning in the kitchen, together with the candles, matches, and extra torch. It's a good rule to keep a well-lit place to retreat to if the need arises. Having different forms of light is always advisable, in case the visitor has the ability to disrupt them. All was clear in the scullery and the dining room at the rear of the house. They had a sad, musty, rather sombre air, a sense of life suspended. Neat piles of newspapers lay curled on the dining room table. In the scullery, a tray of shriveled onions sprouted quietly in the darkness. But Lockwood found no visual traces anywhere, and I heard no noise. The delicate knocking sound I detected whenever we first entered seemed to have died away. As we walked back up to the hall, Lockwood gave a little shudder, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. The air was noticeably colder now. I checked the reading, 9 degrees this time. At the front of the building were two squarish rooms on either side of the wall. One had a television set, a sofa, two comfy armchairs. Here the temperature was warmer, back to the level of the kitchen. We looked and listened anyway and found nothing. On the opposite side, a formal sitting room contained the usual chairs and cabinets arranged before large net-swathed windows and three enormous ferns in terracotta pots. It seemed a little chilly. 12 degrees showed on the luminous dial, colder than the kitchen. Might mean nothing, might mean a lot. I closed my eyes, composed myself, and prepared to listen. "Lucy, look!" Lockwood's voice hissed. "There's Mr. Hope." My heart jolted. I spun around, rapier half drawn, only to find Lockwood, stooped and casual, peering at a photo on the side table. He had his torch trained on it, an image hung in a little circle of floating gold. "Mrs. Hope's here as well," he added. "You idiot," I hissed. "I might have run you through." He chuckled. "Oh, don't be so grumpy. Take a look. What do you think?" It was a grey-haired couple standing in a garden. The woman, Mrs. Hope, was an older, happier version of the daughter we'd met outside, round-faced, neat-clothed, and wearing a radiant smile. Her head was level with the chest of the man beside her. He was tall and balding, with sloped round shoulders and big, cumbersome forearms. He too smiled broadly. They were holding hands. "Seem cheerful enough here, don't they?" Lockwood said. I nodded dubiously. "Got to be a reason for a type 2. Though George said type 2 always means someone's done something to somebody." "Yes, but George has a nasty, gruesome little mind. Which reminds me, we should find a phone and ring him. I left a message on the table, but he'll probably be worrying about us even so. Let's finish off the survey first." He didn't find any death glows in the little sitting room, and I couldn't hear anything. That was the ground floor done, which told us what we'd already guessed. What we were looking for was upstairs. Sure enough, the moment I set foot on the lowest step, the knocking began again. At first it was no louder than it had been before, a tiny, hollow tap, tap, tapping, like a fingernail on plaster, or a nail being hammered into wood. But with every step I climbed, the echo increased a little, became a little more incessant in my inner ear. I mentioned this to Lockwood, who was treading like a formless shadow at my back. "Getting nippier too," he said. He was right. With every step the temperature was dropping, from 9 degrees to 7 to 6 here, midway up the flight. I paused, zipping up my coat with fumbling fingers, while staring upward into the dark. The stairwell was narrow, and there was no light above me. The higher regions of the house were a clot of shadows. I had a strong desire to swing on my torch, but resisted the impulse, which only made me blinder still. With one hand on my rapier hilt, I continued slowly up the stairs, the knocking growing ever louder, and the cold biting at my skin. Up I went. Louder and louder grew the knocking. Now it was frantic, scratching, tapping sounds. Lower and lower dropped the number on the dial, from 6 degrees to 5, and finally to 4. The blackness of the landing was a formless space. On my left, white banisters hung at head height, like a row of giant teeth. I reached the final stair, stepped out onto the landing, and the knocking noise stopped dead. I checked the luminous dial again. 4 degrees, 11 degrees lower in the kitchen. I could sense my breath pluming in the air. We were very close. Lockwood brushed past me, flicked his torch in a brief reconnaissance. Papered walls, closed doors, dead silence. A piece of embroidery and a heavy frame, faded colours, childish letters, home sweet home. Done years ago, when homes were sweet and safe, and no one hung iron charms above their children's beds before the problem came. The landing was L-shaped, comprising of a small, square space, which we stood, and a long spur running behind us, parallel to the stairs. It had a polished wooden floor. There were 5 doors leading off, one on our right, one straight ahead, and 3 at intervals along the spur. All the doors were closed. Lockwood and I stood silently, using our eyes and ears. Nothing, I said at last. As soon as I got to the top, the knocking noises stopped. Lockwood took a while to speak. No death glows, he said. From the heaviness of his voice, I knew he too felt malaise, that strange sluggishness, the dead weight in the muscles that comes from when a visitor is near. He sighed faintly. Well, ladies first. Lucy, pick a door. Not me. I picked the door at the orphanage case. You know what happened then? Well, that all turned out fine, didn't it? Only because I ducked. All right, let's take this one, but you're going in first. I'd chosen the nearest, the one on the right. It turned out it led to a recently fitted bathroom. Modern tiling gleamed eagerly as the torchlight swept by. There was a big white bath, a sink and toilet, and also a distant smell of jasmine soap. Neither of us found anything noticeable in there, although the temperature was the same as the landing. Lockwood tried the next door. It opened to a large black bedroom that had been converted, possibly, into the messiest study in London. Torchlight showed a heavy wooden desk set beneath a curtained window. The desk was almost invisible under the stacks of papers, and further teetering piles were placed higgledy-piggledy all across the room. A row of dark bookshelves, chaotically filled, ran down 3/4 of the wall, far side. There were cupboards, an old leather chair beside the desk, and a faintly masculine smell about the room. I tasted aftershave, whiskey, even tobacco. It was bitterly cold now. The dial at my belt showed 2 degrees. I stepped carefully around the paper stacks and pulled apart the curtains, disturbing enough dust to set me coughing. Dim white light from the houses across the garden drifted into the room. Lockwood was looking at an ancient frayed rug upon the wooden floor, nudging it to and fro with the toe of his shoe. Odd pressure marks, he said. Used to be a bed here before Mr. Hope took over. He shrugged, surveying the room. Maybe he's come back to sort out his paperwork. That is it, I said. This is where the source is. Look at that temperature. Don't you feel heavy, almost numb? Lockwood nodded. Plus, it's here where Mrs. Hope saw her legendary moving shape. A door slammed loudly somewhere below us, in the house. Both of us jumped. I think you're right, Lockwood. This is the place. We should rig up a circle here. Filings or chains? Oh, filings. Filings will be fine. Are you sure? It's not even 9 o'clock, and its power's already strong. Not that strong. Besides, whenever Mr. Hope wants, I can't believe, or whatever he wants, I can't believe he's suddenly turned malevolent. Filings will be more than adequate. He hesitated. Also, I looked at him. Also what? I forgot to bring the chains. Don't stare at me like that. You do weird things with your eyes. You forgot to bring the chains, Lockwood? George took them out to oil them, and I didn't check he'd put them back, so it's George's fault, really. Listen, it doesn't matter. We don't need them for a job like this, do we? get the iron set up while I scan the other rooms. We'll focus here. I had a lot more to say, but now wasn't the time. I took a deep breath. Well, don't get into trouble, I said. Last time you went wandering off during the case, you got yourself locked in a toilet. A ghost shut me in, I keep telling you. So you claim. There wasn't a shred of evidence that, but he was already gone. Didn't take me long to carry out my task. I hauled several stacks of dusty yellow paper over the edges of the room to make a space in the centre of the floor. Then I pulled the rug aside and scattered the filings in a circle, giving it a fairly small radius so as not to waste the iron. This would be our primary refuge, where we could retreat to if necessary, but we might need other circles too, depending on what we found. I went out into the landing. I'm just going to go down and get more iron. Lockwood's voice echoed from a nearby bedroom. Fine, can you put the kettle on? Yeah. I crossed to the stairs, glancing at the open bathroom door. When I put my hands on the banister rail, the wood was freezing to the touch. I hesitated at the top, listening hard, then descended towards the grainy illumination of the hallway. A few steps down, and I thought I heard a rushing noise behind me, but when I turned back, I saw nothing. With my hand on my rapier, I continued to the bottom and walked along the hall to where the kitchen's warm glow shone through the crack in the door. Dim as it was, the lantern light made me screw up my eyes. As I went in, I helped myself to a cheeky biscuit, rinsed out the mugs, and put the kettle on again. Then I picked up the 2 duffel bags and, with some difficulty, prised the hall door open with my foot. I moved back into the hall, which, thanks to the bright kitchen, seemed even darker than before. There was no sound in the house. I couldn't hear anything of Lockwood. Presumably he was still scanning the final bedrooms. I climbed the stairs slowly, from cool to cold to colder, holding the heavy bags awkwardly on the side. I reached the landing and heaved the bags down with a little sigh. When I raised my head to call Lockwood, I saw a girl standing there. And that's the end of chapter 2. Just gonna leave it there for today. Thanks for listening. And we'll continue the theme, different days of the week. Trying to think, we'll have a horror day, we'll have a fantasy book day, might have a romance day. But